Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The clouds blanketed the skyscrapers and high-rise apartments, completely blotting out the moon and stars. It was cool outside, enough to make goosebumps rise on the skin, but not enough to keep the weekend revelers from venturing, swerving, and reeling into the night. Matilda sat in her car for a few minutes, parked 2 blocks away from downtown, and she watched as a fine mist obscured her windshield. It's a perfect night for haunting, she thought. Hopefully, the rain would hold until the partiers had gone home and the city's streets were truly quiet. She flipped her visor open and checked her face. She was glad she'd opted for the white grease paint tonight instead of her usual pale foundation. It would be a pain to take off later, even with alcohol and baby wipes, but it wouldn't run in the rain. Her black lipstick glittered in the light of the orange street lamps. The matte black eyeshadow, her black sclera lenses, the centerpiece, and the pride and joy of her appearance made her look as if her eyes had been carved out, a skull's empty sockets. She adjusted her black duster and shirt and pushed her curly black hair around until she felt it was sufficiently big enough to stand up to the elements. By the time she was done, the view through the windshield had blurred to the orange splotches of streetlight beams and soft, smoky grays of buildings. She stepped out of the car, and the banging of the door echoed off the sides of the buildings when she closed it. She heard the thrum of live music pulsing from downtown, and she headed for it, her black duster billowing behind her, Doc Martens kerthwumping against the damp sidewalk. Too old to go trick-or-treating, but too young to work in haunted houses, something she had desperately wanted to do since childhood. She and her best friend Dave were casting about for ideas of what to do on the holiday last year. Originally, this was supposed to be a one-off Halloween prank. Dave cooked it up during one of his more sativa-induced moments of genius while watching countdowns related to the Great Clown Scare of 2016, which was a period of a few months between June and November of that year, when mysterious clowns started popping up on the news and social media and in people's backyards. The prank was a resounding success. She and Dave, along with a few of his friends, dressed in masks and makeup, chased people leaving haunted houses until security was called. Then they followed and chased groups of little kids through their neighborhoods, and ended with scaring dressed-up late-night revelers leaving costume parties and bars. One woman with an elaborate outfit of shimmering scales, horns, and fins threw her best of costume trophy at them before she fumbled her car door open and sped off. As the woman raced away, Matilda, Dave, and his friends howled in laughter and triumph. She suffered all through school the next day. Her legs ached from running. Her eyes felt like they were being scraped with sandpaper every time she blinked, after having only gotten 2 or 3 hours of sleep and wearing her sclera lenses for too long. She still had dark creases around her eyes from the makeup she'd worn the night before. She wanted nothing more than to collapse in sheer exhaustion. But each time she felt herself nodding off, she thought of the great time she and Dave and his friends had, the euphoria she felt running after a screaming victim, the hoots and hollers and high fives afterward. It felt good to imagine she had more than one real friend. The people she hung around with were just Dave's friends. She and Dave had known each other since 4th grade. when they bonded over being the only two kids that hung around the back fence during recess. She noticed the strange protrusion where his navel should have been. She'd also seen all the Alien movies. It looked like a chestburster had gotten turned around and was slowly working itself out through his lower intestine. She pointed and said,
"Ew, what's that coming out of your stomach?"
He gave her a gapped-toothed smile that reminded her of a jack-o'-lantern, puffed out his thin chest, and pulled up his shirt to reveal his protruding navel.
"It's my outie button,"
he proclaimed, lisping through the holes in his mouth. An in-depth discussion was followed about innies and outies until recess was over. 8 years later, that same gap-toothed alien queen belly booger was busted for possession and sent to live with an aunt who lived out of town as part of his probation. Without Dave as a catalyst, his friends, who had tolerated her only because she was Dave's best friend, had scattered to the four winds. She knew Dave's friends thought she was annoying because none of them were afraid to state their opinion about her. She never let it bother her. She normally just flipped them off and ignored them. Now that Dave was doing time, as he called it during her visits and his phone calls, and it seemed that his friends had disappeared, she was starting to feel lonely. She closed her eyes for a moment and raised her face to the sky as she walked, and she felt the mist gather and drip down her skin. At least I still have this, she thought. She stalked the deserted streets, looking for victims. She got one good chase out of the night. She caught a young woman and her date leaving a country club, getting a little too familiar with each other. She followed them to the multi-level parking garage of an upscale high-rise, always staying about half a block away from them at first. Closer when they noticed.
"Get the fuck away from us!"
the man shouted. The woman pulled out her cell phone from her purse and started recording herself as she tried to jog in her high heels, narrating what was happening. She turned and yelled,
"Who are you? What the hell do you want?"
She chased them all the way to an elevator in the garage, and the sound of her boots hitting the pavement echoed off the concrete walls. The couple tumbled into the elevator, and they were cowering in a knotted mass of limbs in the corner of the contraption when she appeared in the doorway. They stared at her with wide eyes and gaping mouths. She stared back, letting a smile play on her lips. The door gave a harsh, two-toned chum chime before the door started to close. Matilda noticed that the woman still had the phone trained on her.
"Come play with us,"
Matilda said in a high, childlike voice. Generic, yes, but it was the first thing she could think to say before the doors closed. As soon as she heard the elevator begin to ascend, she allowed herself a moment to release her stifled laughter. She had never been able to get so close before, or had such goofy, dumb victims. That had been the best encounter yet. As she stepped out of the garage, the mist became more earnest in its pretensions to rain. She called it a night and returned to her car a few blocks away. Inside her car, she leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes. They were starting to feel itchy and irritated from the contacts, and it felt good to close them. Her arms and legs felt like they weighed a ton, and she felt as if the seat would absorb her into itself. She didn't realize until then how exhausted she felt. A tap on the window jolted her awake. She looked around for a moment, discombobulated about why she was seated in her car. Then she remembered that she'd fallen asleep in her seat before even driving home. She saw a pale face gazing at her through the rain-blurred window. "The cop," she thought, scrambling to roll down the window, probably wondering what I'm doing in weird makeup in the middle of the night. She rolled down the window and tried to come up with a quick explanation for herself. Then, noticed it was Dave, oil-slicked eyes staring at her, a lopsided grin on his matte black lips.
Hey, little girl,
Dave said.
what you doing out here?
She fumbled with the car door as she tried to wrench it open.
Dave? Dave, when did you get back?
She blurted as she scrambled out of her car and threw her arms around his neck.
You bonehead,
she said.
If you'd asked me, I would have gone to pick you up.
It was raining now, but Matilda barely noticed as she held him. There was something she did notice. He wasn't holding her. His back and shoulders were stiff and tight as rails. She also noticed how cool his body felt beneath his black hoodie and t-shirt, and how dry his clothes were. A cold stone of fear swelled in her stomach as she heard Dave hum in a childish, sing-song kind of way. Pop goes the weasel. She remembered that Dave didn't have a pair of sclera lenses or black lipstick, and that he usually wore a goofy clown mask. She disengaged from him and looked up into the oily pits of his eyes, his grin now mirthless.
Fooled ya,
he said. She didn't have time to scream.
Last year I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people, looking to make good money, and since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me all I would have to do is stay in a room, all alone, with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity, and while I was there I would visualize a double of myself. They called it my Tulpa. Seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I'd be paid. And the next day, I began. They brought me to a simple room and gave me a bed, then attached sensors to my head and hooked them in a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again, and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double moving around or try to interact, and so on. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it, first few days. It was more control than any sort of daydreaming I'd done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted. But by the 4th day, I could manage to keep him present for the entire 6 hours. They told me I was doing very well. The 2nd week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. Told me they wanted to see if I could still keep the Tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week they played even more unsettling music, punctuated with shrieks, feedback loops, what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up, guttural noises speaking some foreign language. I just laughed it off. I was a pro by then. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We'd have conversations or play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine him juggling or breakdancing or whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged me. So we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while. And then it got a little strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was a green one. I thought about it for a second and realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. You're using the thought form to access your subconscious, they explained. You knew on some level that you were wrong and you subconsciously corrected yourself. What had been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could question my Tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I could make it quote from whole pages of books I'd read once, years before, or things I was taught and immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my double outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it almost seemed odd to not see him. Whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually, I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends or visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak aloud to him, so I was able to carry out conversations with him, and no one was the wiser. I know that sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of everything I knew and everything I had forgotten, but he also seemed more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp of the minutiae of body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date I brought along was going badly. But he pointed out how she was laughing a little too hard at my jokes and leaning towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of other subtle cues I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and, well, let's just say, that date went very well. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, he was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I'd stop visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that, but he just shrugged it off. So'd I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves, while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of the reasons behind their actions, why some things made them mad and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did, or at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend confronted me one evening. He pounded at the door until I answered it, and came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered when I called you in fucking weeks, you dick," he yelled. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him, and probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my Tulpa grew suddenly furious. "Hit him," it said, and before I knew what I was doing, I had. I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious then than I've ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked him to the ground and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs, and that was when he fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police were by a few minutes later, but I told them that he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they'd let me off with a warning. My Tulpa was grinning the entire time. We spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I'd beaten my friend. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, that I remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. He was present, of course, and knew my thoughts. "You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else anymore," he told me. And I felt my skin crawl. I explained all this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. You can't be scared of something that you're imagining, one told me. My double stood beside him and nodded his head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days, I found myself growing more and more anxious around my Tulpa, and it seemed that he was changing. He looked taller and more menacing. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. No job was worth losing my mind over, I decided. If he was out of control, I'd put him down. I was so used to him at that point that visualizing him was an automatic process, so I started trying my damnedest not to visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to work somewhat. I could get rid of him for hours at a time, but every time he came back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen, his teeth more pointed. He hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months seemed to accompany him everywhere, even when I was at home. I'd relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him, and there he'd be, that howling noise with. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my Tulpa. I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 men grabbed and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jabbed a hypodermic needle into me. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, strapped into the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me, cackling. He hardly looked human anymore. His features were twisted, his eyes were sunken in their sockets, and filmed over like a corpse's. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted, fingernails were like talons. He was, in short, fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I just couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed my restraints as best as I could, but could hardly move at all. Pumping you full of good shit, I think. How's the mind? All fuzzy? Closer and closer as he spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come in and inject me with something, or force-feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused, and sometimes left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking. He interacted with, or perhaps caused, my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me, and then he cut her throat and her blood showered me. It was so real that I could taste. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times, screamed, hurled invectives, demanded answers. They never spoke. They may have talked to my Tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure. I was so doped, confused, that it may have just been more delusional, but I remember them talking with him. I grew convinced that he was the real one and I was the thought form. He encouraged that line of thought at times, mocked me at others. Another thing that I pray was a delusion. Touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He'd poke and prod at me if he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. Once, he grabbed my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him. Another time, he slashed my forearm with one of his talons. I still have a scar, most days. I can convince myself that I injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days. Then one day, while he was telling me a story about how he was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused. A curious look crossed his face and reached out and touched my head, like my mother used to when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment and then smiled. "All thoughts are creative," he told me. Then he walked out of the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out into the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed, weeping like a child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. I got home, eventually. I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved a dresser against it, a long shower, and slept for a day and a half. Nobody came for me in the night. Nobody came the next day or the day after that. It was over. I spent a week locked in that room, but it felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody had even known I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given them were aliases. Even the money I received was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself. It works. Sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister is the latest victim in a spree of killings, they say. The perpetrator mugs his victims, then guts them. The funeral was this afternoon. It was as lovely a service as it can be, I suppose. A little distracted, though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant. Discordant, unsettling stuff that sounds like feedback, and shrieking and a modem dialing up. I still hear it, a little louder now.
Ye needn't think the only folks is the folks hereabouts. H.P. Lovecraft, The Dunwich Horror. Even in this world, more things exist without our knowledge than that with, and the order in creation which you see is that which you have put there. Judge Holden, Blood Meridian. Part 1. New Mexico Territory, 1850. The survivors of the cavalry fled north across the Salt Plains. 10 miles after them, the Comanche retinue pursued. The raid had failed, and now the company were the prey. East was Fort Apache, west was Tijuana, and south lay the fiery furnace of Sonora Desert, endless and white and dead and shimmering under the sun like a boundless sea of glass. North was the only option. They made for Coconino Forest in search of escape and sanctuary. They were all coated in blood and gore, and the black powder from the battle that had carried them wearily across the desert for days now, the ingredients of which sticky against their tattered uniforms like tar. The Comanche savages had pursued the survivors relentlessly since Juarez, and they aimed to finish the job before days out. 42 of the company's men lay cut down and scalped in the desert wastes some ways back. Now there were only 10 more to see to. The raid was ambushed before any defense could even be mounted. The rattling hail of arrows that had descended onto the unit from the ridge days gone, like an unwelcome rain, had sent the cavalry into pandemonium. Plumes of gray gun smoke then echoed in the valley and had carried off into the winds, and the battle raged, but the shots failed to find their targets. After an hour, those at the back saw that the battle was lost and they were routed. The 10 men, under command of Captain Morton, turned on their heels and stole into the shimmering heat of the desert. None of them looked back to see the finale of the nightmare. Men that they knew well were now laid strewn across the sands behind them. They all screamed as the grotesque carnival of savages butchered and danced their way through the company. But it was not over. Those who had survived and fled across the salt plains had merely lived on only to face a new nightmare. Of those men, something far worse awaited them. Of the men who did escape the ambush, there was Morton, the only surviving officer, Corporal, whose Christian name was not known to any man, Jackson, Hughes, Bill, Lewis, Carlson, and Powell. They rode on for days, away from the massacre, all of them fused to their saddles as if they had merged with beasts alike and had become an abstraction of the centaurs before them. It was on the third day that Morton noticed it. Something out there on the prairie behind them, pulsing in the midday heat. On the horizon behind them, a cloud of dust grew. Captain Morton stopped and produced his spyglass and aimed at the cloud. He knew what it was. The Comanche tribe were following them. That much was clear. Morton slammed the spyglass home with the base of his palm and snorted. "We'll not make camp tonight. We'll leave a fire in the night and ride on," he said. The men about obliged. Much later, after the sun had set, the trick did not work. The Comanche knew that it was a gambit. They had ridden past the decoy fire and pursued the remaining cavalry into the twilight all the same. They had expected the routed to flee south across the border, but they did not. The tired survivors rode their horses hard. They whipped and lashed at their horses' behinds, desperate to break away from the pursuers. The night was long and cold and dark. They rode on. And just after dawn, the survivors then saw looming up towards them the deep and brooding forest. A great wall of silhouettes poised there against the tenebrous blue sky of the early morning sun. They believed their salvation was nigh. Yet, something else was instead. Still behind them was the chief and his tribe. However, suddenly, they had lost all compunction to pursue the survivors. They saw their prey and gasped each at what the cavalry in front was about to do. "Key!" one of the Comanches shouted. When the 10 survivors came to the fringe of the forest, the Comanche pursuers suddenly halted as if gripped by something. They snatched and tugged at their reins each, and the horses skidded in the dust 800 meters behind the survivors and the tree line. All of the tribe were suddenly commandeered by unassailable fear now. They had been focused on the mission of dispatching the survivors so much that they had not noticed just where they were pursuing them to. The dreaded forest. The motionless Comanche leader watched on as Morton and the 9 other survivors disappeared into the wall of dark trees. One of the savages mumbled some kind of prayer and shut his eyes of the sight. The chief knew that all who went into that forest never came back out again. There was something else in there. Something old. They turned around, panic-stricken, and rode quickly back in the direction they had just come from. Part 2. Deep in the trees, the men teetered and trotted through in silence. They had been riding in it for almost an hour. The decaying forest all around wholly unnatural. Drizzle fell and the trees creaked in the languid breeze. No other sounds apart from the hooves moving through it all. Rows and rows of unmoving pine trees sprawling endlessly before them, bearing down on them, yet no sound. They all soon noticed the eerie quiet. "You hear that?" Bill called out. "I don't hear nothing," Hughes replied after a pause. "Exactly. Forest this big and not so much as a bird making noise? Strange." "Keep it down," Morton then barked. "Could be another ambush." They moved on down gulches and finally stopped at a trickling fetid stream to fill their canteens and tend to their wounds. The ride took most of the morning. Lewis had caught an arrow in his arm during the ambush a few days ago, and his shoulder was beginning to fester. His linen shirt was stained brown with pus and blood, and the flies all about swarmed him eagerly. None offered consultation on his injury. Morton knelt down to the water and considered his reflection in the blade of his bowie knife. He looked 10 years older than what he was. As he examined his face in the metal, though, he caught sight of something. Up on the ridge to his left, something moved. Something big. Too big to be Comanche. Morton snapped his gaze left and up at the ridgeline at the sight. He had thought he saw something move in his peripheries. He was sure of it. But peering up there now, he saw nothing. Only beams of sunlight slanted through the dead trees and onto him, and there was nothing else up there. He frowned, then resigned himself to the task of filling his canteen and shaving his sideburns. The men about him were solemn and filled with dread, like the attendees of some morbid wake. Morton calculated that any further acknowledgement of anything untoward would only panic the men further. He chose not to mention it to his retinue. Hughes, however, had already seen something. He stood motionless in the river, the water up to his knees. He stared up absently at the same point on the ridge that the captain was looking at. His eyes were wide with terror, and he quivered in his boots. "Hughes, what you looking at, boy?" Corporal snapped, noticing his odd behavior. Hughes did not respond. He just kept staring up at the part of the ridge where the sun straddled the earth. "Hughes, fall in line," Captain Morton barked. Hughes came back to reality, the tears still fresh in his eyes. He looked up at Morton on his horse. They shared a glance. "Yes, sir," Hughes said obediently, and shuffled out of the river to collect his personal effects laying on the waxed tarp at the bank. After a small rest, they mounted and rode on. The day was almost out, and their pace had slowed to a crawl as they negotiated over mires and small ravines. When night fell, they stopped and made camp up on a ridge that overlooked the boundless mass of dark trees. They could not see the edge of the forest. Captain Morton briefed his men and devised a rota for sentry duty. They made a fire and oriented their sleeping bags around it. All of them huddled around the only warmth like a litter of starved puppies waiting for their mother to return. Jackson had first watch. After taking on some cold coffee, he navigated through the dimness of the forest and stood at a point 50 meters away from the campfire. He then held his rifle loosely and stared off into the brooding night. It was a long shift. Later, after Jackson's sentry duty was over, he was relieved by Lewis, who took up the exact footprints in the dirt that he had made himself. Jackson then came back to his roll mat and bag of particulars and saw that the roll mat next to his own was empty. Powell was not there. Jackson frowned and noted the man's possessions and rifle were still by the fire. "Where's Powell?" Jackson asked Hughes. "Gone," Hughes muttered as he spat into the fire. He was sharpening his knife but was not focusing on the task at hand. Instead, he merely rubbed the filthy whetstone up and down the blade with seemingly random motions. "How long has he been gone?" "Reckon about 2 hours now. Said he was going for a shit. Ain't came back." Jackson nervously knelt down to Hughes. "You reckon them Indians followed us in here after all?" he whispered. "I reckon they did," Hughes said, and his eyes darkened as he stared into the flames. "There will be blood tonight. I take no sleep. You can be sure of that." Jackson looked away from Hughes and pondered what he meant by such a statement. All the same, he felt something heavy fall into his chest. Dread. Hughes stared absently into the fire as if taken by something. He would not say what exactly and didn't speak for the rest of the night. Jackson smoked a cigarette and tried to forget about the whole notion. It was almost midnight. The men about the fire snoozed and dreamed of seeing the inside of a saloon again. They fantasized about collecting their wages and buying a hot bath, a bottle of whiskey, and a seat at the poker table. The swollen silver moon hung above them all in the black starless sky like a great primordial egg, or like an augury to their own fates. The fire cracked and smoldered, and no other sounds were heard. Jackson slept and snored softly. Then from somewhere out in the twilight, something awoke him. One of the men on sentry screamed, a guttural, agonizing screech that echoed through the night. And then, nothing. The men about the fire bolted up in their sleeping bags and reached for their rifles. Cold fear assailed them all like an arctic wind. An icy shiver clawed its way down Jackson's spine. He felt the color drain from his face as he stared out, utterly terrified, into the silent night beyond the campfire. Something was out there in the dark. They all opened their ears to the wilderness but heard nothing. Just silence. None dared to call out for Lewis. Whatever was out there, it had taken him. His screams sounded like choking, then like he was gargling something. Then nothing but the unnerving, widening silence. Jackson's eyes were bulging with terror. He panted and shuddered and tried to take command of his shaking body. "Some bitch," Carlson said. "Something has got Lewis." "What? A bear?" Jackson asked. "I reckon. Can't no Indian produce sounds like that from a man. That boy's been snared by the jaws of a goddamn bear. You heard it on his throat." "Shut up, Carlson. It ain't no bear," Morton shouted. "We got traps all around." "Then what the hell is it?" Morton stood above the cowering party and shook his head, remembering again what he thought he had seen on that ridge earlier. "I don't know, but that ain't no fucking bear." Some of the horses had broken from their hitchings at the sound and had bolted off into the twilight, all frantic and feral like something driven demented with rabies. No one attempted to rein them in. No one dared to leave the fireside. All were too terrified to even think of moving. There was no sleep to be had for the rest of the night. The men all sat up in their bags in a circle. They held their rifles outstretched before them as if like a phalanx, gun barrels probing into the darkness all around. All refused to leave their bags nor the glowing side of the campfire, as if both would offer shielding and insulate them from whatever lurked out there beyond the black trees. A juvenile notion that there was safety in the light. Everyone sat motionless on the freezing ground like a huddle of terrified rabbits, and they could only hope for the morning in safety and solidarity. None dared imagine what it was. They prayed to see a band of savages running out of the darkness toward them. There would be no fear attached to that. But deep down, before any explanation had even been offered, they all knew it was something else. Something much worse. Hughes was eerily calm throughout the whole ordeal. He simply stared ahead into the heaving darkness as if awaiting something. Part 3. Dawn finally crawled around. The men shivered in their spots. The metal of their rifles so cold in their palms it was gnawing into their skin. The morning was damp and gray. After first light, the men, all haggard and haunted and pale from the night gone, jumped out of their rolls and packed away their possibles. The lines and wrinkles on their grayed and weathered faces even more prominent. No coffee was made. Everyone packed and stuffed their possessions into the saddlebags with quick, skittish movements, looking all around as they did, like birds nervously checking behind them as they fed. Carlson remained at the perimeter of the camp on sentry, whilst the rest prepared to leave. He fixed his eyes on points in the trees. In the gloom of the dawn, however, the woods all around blurred and merged into shades of mottled brown. It was hard to distinguish anything at all. There was no movement in that teetering dimness. Not even woodland animals could be heard. "What do you suppose that was last night?" Bill asked the somber group. "Indians," Hughes replied, lying to himself. "Like I said they would be." No one else said anything. They saddled up quickly and rode on through miles of tall, swaying trees, checking frequently over their shoulders as they did. Lewis was not found. Only his rifle remained, bent into a U shape and tossed into the brush 5 meters from his sentry point the night before. They moved as one entity, horse and man, men and horses, all locked into a common alliance of survival, no one being separate from another. A covenant of mutual diligence from both creatures, as if the very nature of Lewis's gruesome disappearance had ignited the primal instincts of being prey long dormant in both man and beast. The sun was low and white, and the rays barely filtered through the branches onto them. After another hour, they came to a small creek, then a valley. And further down that valley, they found Lewis. He had been disemboweled and dismembered, and his head sat in the cavity of his own chest, his dull fish eyes now frozen in their sockets like two orbs of jelly staring up absently at the clouded gray sky beyond the canopy of trees. Flies buzzed around his desecrated body, and the stench was unbearable for the men. Morton gagged and spat from the side of his horse. The men gawked and stared silently at Lewis's corpse, all too stunned and horrified to speak. They rode on, and no eulogies were said. No one dared to speculate what manner of living thing existed on this earth that could do that to another. It was late in the afternoon the next day. The men were tired beyond saving. No sleep was had, and they remained unfed. The horses scuttled through the underbrush wearily as if being led through it all in a trance. The tall grass tickled their underbellies as they stepped and scrabbled over the terrain. The men moved forward, and still the force kept coming forward back at them. No matter how far they all moved, it seemed there was no edge to the trees. Hughes, at the back of the party, swayed from side to side in his saddle. His eyes rolled around in their sockets, and he could not focus on the ride anymore. He was so tired and delirious that he had noticed the party were no longer in front of him, and he had been riding off in the opposite direction for a long time. He could only recall the horrific sight of Lewis back there in the valley. He had never told anyone what he saw up there on that ridge, but he knew it in his heart that it had done that to Lewis. The shadow that walked and made mockery of the man's body, and Hughes wondered who of the party would be next. It was only after another 10 minutes that the party all noticed he was no longer with them. Morton had called for Hughes to come to his side for assistance with the compass, but when there was no response, they all looked over their shoulders for the first time in a while and saw that he was gone. "Hughes!" Morton bellowed into the trees, but was met with no response. Morton then turned to his second in command. "Corporal, he's fallen behind. Go get him," Captain Morton shouted. Corporal sat on top of his horse near the front of the party like he had received a final summons. The prospect of riding back alone turned his stomach. He quivered in his saddle and merely looked back at Captain Morton with doe eyes, like a child. "Did you not hear me?" Morton snapped. "I heard you just fine, but I'll not do it," he said as his horse tottered underneath him. Morton glared at Corporal with blistering red eyes. "He has a second compass. Do it," he snarled. "Can't no man compel another to tasks he ain't equipped for. A higher-ranking man can, and you are equipped for it. In the confines of a regular scenario, I reckon so, but this ain't no regular scenario, sir. I'll not do it. There's something. You will, or I will shoot you." Morton soon produced his Colt revolver and pointed it at Corporal. The party froze in anticipation. Corporal squirmed, but only for a moment. "Then shoot me, goddammit, and I'll be shut of this," Corporal snarled. "Better than the fate out yonder them trees. You saw what they did to his body. But consider this. You'll have one less soul watching your back if you do shoot me dead now. You reckon you can make it out these woods alive on your lonesome?" Morton locked eyes with Corporal and both stared at each other menacingly. Corporal had begun to slowly reach for his cattleman revolver, the hand movements slow like a snake's. Morton watched. All about the pair expected blood, but the fight never came to fruition. Morton considered then slid the hammer up and holstered his revolver once more. "Bill, you go back and bring him back here," Morton instead said over his shoulder to Bill. Jackson's eyes vacillated between Corporal, Morton, and Bill. Bill nodded obediently and turned and rode back into the twisted mess of branches and bark. The unit then all watched him silently as his form dwindled against the bleakness of that raw mass of ancient wood. "That ain't Indians out there. That's something else," Corporal muttered to himself. Jackson pretended he had not heard it. Later in the day, and neither Bill nor Hughes returned. After an hour waiting, Morton decided that they were not coming back, and they rode on. Night fell with practiced bravado. The overcast lowering clouds smothered and sucked all warmth and comfort from both earth and man. They made camp near a large boulder, and the night was long and uneventful. They sat around the fire, and each man stared into the flames, each man seeing something unique in the effulgence, as if the flames themselves were extensions of man's hubris unto the world, burning in all directions without a moment's consideration on where to go next. In the morning, they rose and saddled up and dispatched without admin. The day was long and monotonous, and Jackson began to wonder if they were merely going in circles. He had sworn he had seen that same fallen tree before, and that same trickling stream. Time moved forward without definition, but then, 5 miles north on a fallen tree, the unit soon found the severed heads of their lost men. Bill, who had ridden ahead to investigate Hughes's disappearance, Powell, who had disappeared the night previous, and Hughes himself, who had fallen behind. All 3 bloodied heads now sat on the moss-covered tree trunk in front of Morton like some gawky exhibition. He looked down from his horse at the carnival scene and recognized nothing of the men he once knew from his unit. They were gone, and the husks they had left behind held nothing anymore. They looked to him like a row of coconuts that one would throw rocks at, a fairground game that people would laugh at. The hacked-off heads nothing more than a pantomime of gore. Bill's lifeless eye looked up at Morton from there on the tree with an absence that could only now be acknowledged as existence. He once was, and now he was no more. His grayed head perched on the tree trunk with one eye shut and the other lazily, vacantly, looking up at his captain. Paul had no jaw, and instead, his head sat on the bark like some grotesque ornament. His face festooned with dried black blood. He had no eyes. They had been scooped out and replaced with dried grass. "What the hell done that?" Carlson mewed. "Indians," Morton said, and no one believed him. "They ain't no Indians doing. Them faces got bite marks on them. You sent Bill off like that, Captain." "Quiet," Morton then shouted, and Carlson did. Morton sighed deeply and shut his eyes to regain some semblance of composure. They rode on in silence. They were down to 4 men now: Corporal, Carlson, Captain Morton, and Jackson. Later, they found a small river at the base of the valley and set up camp next to it. Corporal sat in the dirt, his knees pulled up to his chest. He stared vacantly into the rolling flames of the campfire as each man about him did also. Morton watched him from the other side of the yellow blades of fire. Jackson smoked his last cigarette. "Hughes saw it, didn't he?" Corporal asked Jackson in a low, defeated voice. "I mean, whatever it is out there." "I reckon." "You got a woman?" he then asked strangely. "No." "Ever been with one?" "A whore." "Where?" "El Paso." "I have a wife, Dolores. She's waiting for me." Jackson flicked the butt of his cigarette into the fire and struggled to find the right words. "I'll not wait here any longer for judgment," Corporal said after 5 minutes. "I'm leaving tonight, one ways or another." "You go it alone and you die," Jackson replied. "I'd take my chances. We're as good as dead sitting here anyhow. Whatever that is out there, it ain't of this world. It's hunting us. There are things abroad out here, and I'll have no part of them. With that, Corporal rose silently and unhitched his horse and rode off into the darkness without so much as a word passed. Captain Morton sucked on his pipe and watched him leave and said nothing also. Jackson watched the behind of the horse and Corporal alike steal away into the wall of inky black. Corporal was never seen again. With the departure, the three survivors then fell in on themselves, the crushing gloom and their souls heavy against their bodies like chains of bondage. The fire smoldered, and no man rose to furnish it with more wood. All were too taken with the plight to think of anything else. The remaining 3 horses had escaped at some point in the small hours of the night. They had chewed through their bindings and took solace in escape, seemingly seeing more promising refuge in the smothering black out there. The next day the men rose, all gray and sullen and beaten. They saw that the horses were gone and could not afford any more than a grunt and a sigh at their passage. They packed their things and walked north. The day was arduous, and it carried with it the sense of guilt or some abstraction of survivors' guilt therein. Why, when all the others had fallen, did these 3 stand? The remaining 3 then made camp at nightfall with what provisions they had carried with them. They did not eat and instead installed themselves in their bags, all facing outward. They sat and waited and dreamed of home. The night was heavy and vibrating and was full of strange rustlings. Beyond the meager glow of the campfire, something was moving around quietly out there. Something big and heavy, but stealthy and taciturn. It was coming closer. Twigs snapped and the earth squirmed under something. All of them heard it, but they refused to acknowledge it just the same. They prayed it was wolves out there on the perimeter, but it was not. The fire died later, and only the oil lamp illuminated the cold, dark floor of the forest about, a small island of light against a sea of black. They sat, waiting on guard, ready for any advance. It was much further into the night when Jackson's eyelids finally began to sag. He hadn't slept in almost 3 days, and he could not fight it any longer. At some point, he didn't know when, his head slumped forward and he leaned down into his chest. The rifle fell against his head but went unacknowledged. Then he closed his eyes and everything went quiet. He awoke later only to hear the shrill screaming of Carlson assaulting his ears. There was this savage, jarring scream that filtered through the trees and had awoken him from his sleep. "Help!" Carlson shouted. "It's got me! Please, help!" He shouted as he was dragged off into blackness. Jackson bolted up from his slumber and looked around, the spit in his mouth clumpy and salty. His eyes were swollen shut still with the task of sleep. Jackson looked to his left. On the ground where Carlson was sitting, not moments earlier, were now drag marks leading off into the grass. There were claw marks also, and clumps of underbrush had been ripped from their roots by something. Carlson shrieked somewhere back in the forest. "God damn!" Jackson gasped in horror. He instinctively reached for his rifle and stood up in the gloom. "What the hell is this?" Carson's dwindling screams then slithered off into nothingness, and his gut-wrenching cries of despair soon vanished. And both Jackson and Morton stood up from their bags and positioned themselves back to back next to the oil lamp, both rifles facing out. Neither one of them saw what took Carlson. "Holy Jesus, what is it?" Jackson asked. "I don't know," Morton replied. "I really don't know." His voice was cracking. The forest was silent again, and the pair stood by the hollow glow of the lamplight with all the loneliness and dread in the world bearing down on them, both men awaiting their turn. Minutes went by like hours, and Jackson probed into the pit of his stomach in search of a warmth he might have called hope. The only reassurance he felt was Morton's bulky back pressed against his own. The last two tethered together in an uneasy partnership of survival. "He's gonna come back," Jackson said. "I know." It's gonna take us next." They stood together like two stalagmites, soldered down to the primal earth below their boots. They waited, and there was nothing. Minutes went by. "How long you calculate till dawn?" Jackson whispered to Morton after another few minutes. But there was no reply. "Sir?" Jackson asked. He turned around and saw that Morton was gone. "Sir?" he asked once more. Dropping his gaze to the floor, he saw what remained. On the ground by Jackson's feet was a bloodied rifle and Morton's cavalry hat, all ripped up. "My God," he said as he stared down at all that was left of his captain. Without even thinking, Jackson turned and ran. He snatched up the oil lamp and panted and screamed as he lurched forward through the woods, away from the scene, away from it all. He ran and ran. Then, without prelude, he smacked his head on a low-hanging branch and fell into the mud. His body dropped into the mire, and he lay there for a pause. His hearing rang like someone was firing an Evans repeater right next to his head. Tingling, nauseating noise that sounded like iron pots being kicked down the stairs. When he came around again, he sat up blearily in the dirt, and he heard it. Something was coming toward him. Lumbering, heavy footsteps squelching through the marsh. Jackson cautiously stood up. The noise had brought him back to reality, and he took hold of himself once more. He was trembling. He could barely keep a grip on his rifle. He retreated 2 steps and found his back against a tree, the rough bark prodding through his thin blazer. His eyes darted in all directions, squinting into the shroud, trying to spy the origin of the low steps stalking ever closer to him. He looked right and saw nothing. He looked left and saw only unending blackness. Then he peered forward once more and saw it. He gasped, and the rifle fell from his suddenly weakened grip. There in front of him was a giant shadow, this immense black gargoyle that seemed not to have form nor aspect. Just this mass of wet, reeking fur. It had protrusions and antlers spouting from every angle on its behemoth-like body that moved around like driftwood caught in a tide. It came closer and leaned down to Jackson. He whimpered. His lips quivered and a tear rolled down his blistered face. "Please, have mercy," he tried to say, but his voice shook too much for the words to be distinguished. The breath of the beast was hot and wet and rancid on his face. It smelled like rotting flesh, copper, and stagnant lake water. Its giant damp snout inches from his own. It snorted and steaming strings of saliva hit his face. He held the oil lamp up in the darkness and saw only a massive, slimy, and hairy mouth in front of him. All the dripping red gore clinging to its flat, square teeth. He screamed, but not for long. It was cut short by the towering, goatish beast before him. Back at the Comanche camp, the chief snapped up from a horrific nightmare. Cold sweat rolled down his face and he puffed and panted. Somewhere deep in his dreams, he had seen that all of the survivors who had gone into that forest were now dead. But it was what would happen to them after death that made the chief feel utterly terrified. Their souls would never find rest, and he knew that. His wife reached up to console him, but it was not warranted. He pushed her away and stared forward at the opening in the teepee, past it and out into that ever-expanding blackness of night. Out there, he knew the things still lingered. He did not see the face that killed them all, nor hear its movements in his nightmare, but only knew its presence as an ancient and evil spirit. It had no name, and he knew those men would not be the last to perish in that forest because of it.
The Brazilian name for the red fish, known among scientific circles as the arapaima. If you've never heard of the red fish before now, then prepare yourself, because you won't be forgetting it anytime soon. Imagine a living torpedo, pushing 10 feet and 500 pounds of bone, muscle, and iron-hard scales. Imagine a primordial, upturned, snake-like head, helming a sleek, tapering body behind it, sporting drab olive green on its flanks that melds into vibrant floral red as it approaches its scallop-shaped tail. Now, give this creature a psychological addiction to power and speed, and an unyielding temper to match. To put it another way, people have died from this fish, being struck by their solid bony heads as they jump. With cracked skulls or ruptured lungs, they fall out of their boats and sink, unable to draw breath. Darkness and turbulent mud, the last thing they see before the light snuffs out. Those who survive an attack walk away with broken bones, scarred hearts, and a healthy newfound fear literally hammered into them. In terms of diet, however, they only eat small animals. Humans are off the menu. Their aggressive responses are triggered when they feel cornered, or during the breeding season when protecting their young. But in my opinion, it doesn't make it much better. Consider this. Which animal would impart the worst death? The one that kills for food because it has to? Or the one whose only concern is ensuring its own survival by any means necessary? That's what we were after. That's what motivated our endeavor of greed and destruction. That's what led to where we are today. Here and there, all over the place, spread out so thin, we'll never be put back together. Acquisitors is the term I'd use to describe ourselves. Our organization existed solely to provide covert resources in the acquisition of whatever it was we were paid to nab. Laws, politics, socioeconomic status. It mattered not to us, as long as the client followed through with the price we quoted. After that, it was no questions asked. We did what we needed to follow through on our word. No double standards. No acknowledged pleasantries. Point A to point B. Depending on the jobs we carried out, and those who fell victim to our work, we were given a host of other labels, each nastier than the rest. Mercenaries, traffickers, thieves, assassins. And in the case of the red fish, poachers. I perfectly remember the conversation I had earlier that day. The palace seemed to breathe gold with its gilded pillars and cavernous hallways that swam in dim candlelight. Private security guards led me down the corridors to my client's den, an opulent office space adorned with expensive frescoes and cages of exotic birds. Behind the client's desk was a window the size of a small house, overlooking the Essequibo River, gleaming silver and yellow in the rising sun. The whole place stank of exploitation and arrogance. I gazed at the rosewood walls rising 2 stories above, almost hearing the cries of the animals and trees that had once called this plot of land home. But I hadn't come here to judge. My client regarded me with a stony expression as I sat down. Maybe he thought the live jaguar dozing on his desk between us would be intimidating, to give him some kind of edge over me. But I met his face with a similar blankness. It would take more than a jungle cat to impress me. "Thank you for agreeing to meet here," he said. He gestured around his den. "You like it?" "It's, very grandiose," I settled with. "Very," he agreed. "Spared no expense. I have the will and I have the means. Who am I to deny what I want?" He scratched the jaguar's ears, who replied with a syrupy growl. "Unfortunately, despite my best efforts, there are still things in this world that elude me. Have you heard of the Pirarucu?" gringo. Red fish, I answered. Yeah, I know of it. Mana of the gods, he said wistfully. One fish can feed a village for a week. And for the more inclined towards the culinary arts, they make for the most wonderful seared steaks. I tell you, man, I have sampled beasts from all over the world, and none compared to the pirarucu. His tone hardened. But the local government does not respect my tastes. As we speak, our representatives, and I do use that term loosely, are ratifying laws banning the harvesting of the red fish. Try as I might, I cannot sway a coalition of progressive bureaucrats. And all this is on the heels of a biannual feast I throw for my friends in this beautiful palace. Every 6 months, I serve prime pirarucu cuts to my guests. It's the only thing I can exclusively offer to them. But if I cannot get what I want this time, then I have no leverage, no standing. He stood up, pacing around his desk. I refuse to be anything less than I have proven to be. I need to uphold my image. I need the red fish. You want me to illegally capture and bring back a wild, pirarucu, I guessed. Hit the nail on the head, he confirmed, punching to stroke the jaguar's flank. I nodded. I never thought I'd have to play a glorified fisherman in my line of work, but work was work, and I dwelled on it no further. Sounds straightforward enough. Can you possibly tell me where I can find them? Actually, I can, my client said, straightening up. Upriver, about 20 miles, is a reserve, for lack of a better term. A tract of wetland some liberal environmentalist types have set up for the pirarucu. Probably American, he added with distaste. The red fish is rare enough in these parts already. Way I see it, you can scour the jungle for days, rooting through lakes and swamps in the off chance you find a suitable specimen. Or you could sneak into the reserve, slip past the Americans, and just pick one up, like it was a bag of groceries. I briefly considered the options. Expediency is my MO, I said. Me and my men will infiltrate that reserve and find you the biggest, fattest pirarucu they have. No one will stand in our way. My client smiled and held out his hand. You, sir, you're one of the good ones. The journey upriver could not have gone any smoother. I gathered together a crew of contacts stationed in the country, all dressed in civilian attire. We were to pose as a group of old friends, reuniting in Guyana for a bit of sport fishing along the river. Quote, unquote, just like we used to. We'd take the ferry up to the tributary, claiming we wanted to fish the point where it merged with the main channel, then slowly make our way up until we hit the entrance to the reserve. The gear bags and tackle boxes we brought along with us, in fact, held spear guns, crossbows, and pistols. We hoped the first two weapons would be all we needed to quickly and stealthily obtain a pirarucu. The pistols would only be if things got out of hand. The trip ate up most of the morning. The only noteworthy thing was the chatterbox of a ferryman who took to probing our crew about what we were doing. I handled all the talking. What are you all fishing for? He inquired. Payara and Trahira, realistically, I answered. And if we're lucky, Surabim. Ah, of course, he exclaimed. So, you're not going after the Piraruku. I feigned confusion. Excuse me? I don't know any other name. It's the big fish with a red tail that jumps. Oh, you mean the Arapaima, I said. No, we're not equipped for those guys. Good, said the ferryman, turning dour. They're on the brink, my friend. Thankfully, they're about to pass laws to protect them. And it was only because of the tribesmen that our gutless politicians finally went through with it. They're tribesmen? I asked, legitimately interested this time. Yes, some indigenous tribes sent ambassadors to come out and try to convince our representatives to help them to protect the Piraruku, he explained. The fish is important for their spiritual practices, see? And they're being wiped out faster than they can keep up with. Yes, we're just too damn good at what we do. He shook his head disdainfully, plundering the river of its resources. I mulled over this new information as he gabbed away. I wondered if the American activists had somehow garnered an agreement with these native tribes to build the reserve together. Only now do I realize how foolish that sentiment was. We disembarked at our stop, 6 of us, 3 per dugout canoe, and paddled up the fateful tributary. The tropical sun was sweltering as we forced ourselves up the channel. It was nearing the end of the dry season. The water was muddy and winding, barely deep enough for our boats in some spots. This was preferable, though. Low waters meant the fish would be contained in isolated pockets, and considering their air-breathing habits, they'd be easy to spot whenever they broke the surface. Jagged, protruding rocks and fallen trees only slightly impeded our progress. We found ourselves occasionally having to drag our canoes over dry land to pass up a barrier, but with 6 men and rates I promised them as payment, nothing was too much for us. The final barrier, a few miles up, piqued my interest. Sharpened wooden pikes jutted from the water facing downstream, like the spiked walls of a moat. Someone had definitely placed them there to keep trespassers out. I stood up in my perch, peering over the pikes. Beyond, the water tapered out into a vast wetland lined with tall grass. "We're here," I said. That's when something pricked me in the neck. I scarcely had time to pluck the thing from my skin when toxic drowsiness overtook my senses. My fingers went limp, and the dart slipped from my grasp into the water. I collapsed, my vision blackening, watching the rest of my crew shudder and fall with me before everything went cold and dark. The sight before us made me wish I had never woken up. I first realized the 6 of us had been stripped and bound, hands knotted with vines behind our backs, forced into a kneeling position on the forest floor. I felt a scalding heat on my face. The very air seemed to shimmer before me, on account of the blazing campfire in front of us, its green wood emitting acrid black smoke. It was still the daytime, early afternoon, so I could easily see our captors surrounding us. One look told me they were indigenous, short, toned, clad only in leaves and loincloths, their deep red skin painted over with vivid black and white skeletal patterns. They sneered and hissed, scepters and spears bristling in their grips. My heart sank. I hadn't prepared for the possibility of such a swift ambush. My client had claimed we'd only be dealing with American activists, not exactly the fighting type. What the ferryman told me suddenly fell into place. The reserve belonged to them. And the Americans, if there even were any, might have met their fates at their hands. "What do you want with us?" I croaked, my throat stinging from the fumes. A bizarre exchange erupted to my left. Someone rasped in what I could only assume to be the tribe's language. A second voice responded in the same tongue. "You came here to hunt the redfish?" The first voice wheezed. I forced myself to look. It took all my willpower not to shout. Strung up between two tribesmen was an emaciated nude white man, his long hair matted and tangled. His lips were cracked, and his eyes were empty, putrescent sockets. To my sustained horror, I saw hollow vines had been stuck under the skin of his sore-ridden arms. Vines that ran up to fluid-filled sacks made of leaves, toted by the tribesmen flanking him. A primitive IV system. They were keeping him just barely alive. To translate. "No!" I yelled, my voice strangled. "We wanted to fish for surubim." The same double exchange. "We searched your bags," the translator snapped. "You do not need spear guns or firearms to hunt surubim." "We use handguns when fishing in Alaska," I countered, thinking on my feet. "We put down halibut once we bring them in our boats. The surubim are no different." The exchange. "You've proven yourself fit for nothing but lies," the translator said. "That will be one bullet for each lie." One of the tribesmen stepped forward and stuck out his arm. I barely registered one of our guns in his hand before he pressed it to one of the men's foreheads and pulled the trigger. The spray of blood hadn't even settled before he executed the next man. We panicked and struggled against our bonds, showered by a fine mist of salty blood. But the tribesman emptied the magazine into the air, the concussive ringing bangs finally forcing us into silence. "Best start talking the truth, or they'll water the ground with the rest of your brains," the translator leered. All right, I gasped, fighting the rising whine in my ear. Yes, we came to find a redfish, but nothing more than that. All we need is one. If you have a sickly one, or even a dead one, that is all that we want. We won't venture here again. We won't tell anyone about you." The exchange. "Pillagers and parasites. That's all you are," the translator growled. "This forest has suffered enough without you worms slowly killing it with just one more piece." "We have no loyalty to our clients," I said. "We are only doing the job we were hired to do. Mere agents of circumstance. We have no stake in either side. We don't deserve your righteous anger. Please, all I ask is to work with me here." The exchange. "If all you seek is a single red fish, then capture one if you can," said the translator. "But you will face the gauntlet. You will crawl through the muck like a small, pathetic creature." He interpreted more vocal growls from the tribesmen. "Make it to the end of the reserve, and you're free to go. But if you have no red fish, you must leave without one and never come back. All the while, we will hunt you." Even as our captors reached down to undo our bonds, scrambled thoughts raged in my mind. I had been in more dangerous situations in the past, but never one where I had been so helpless, so stripped of my faculties. I couldn't imagine my contacts had ever found themselves in such dire straits either. Finishing the job was one thing, but staying alive to actually follow through was something I rarely had to consider. Until today. "We give you no fanfare," the translator said. "Start running." A tribesman knocked an arrow. We bolted, vaulting over the headless corpses of a third of our party. Cruel, mocking laughter followed us as we barreled through the clearing and into the dense cover of trees. The arrow lodged in a trunk barely a foot from my head. The further in we ran, the wetter and flatter the ground became, until we were up to our shins in muddy, putrid swamp water. We stopped, straining to listen out for approaching hunters in the distance. Apart from our sharp, labored panting, we seemed to be alone. The other 3 men took their time to catch their breath. Then, they all turned and glared at me. "What the fuck was that about?" one of them snapped. A man whom I only knew by his code name, Gamma. "Because of you, 2 of us are dead back there," Delta concurred. "Did you know we'd be facing armed hostiles?" Epsilon demanded. "I was never told about any of this," I protested. "Apparently, our client was misinformed." "Or lied," Gamma muttered. "None of that matters now," Epsilon interjected. "What matters is what we do from here. If we get out of the reserve, they will stop hunting us. The pikes are about a mile south. We can make it if we run." "Belay that," I said, stepping up to him. "They're giving us a chance, and if we don't deliver what we promised to our client, we don't get paid, and we get blacklisted upon our return." "We'll die trying to catch one of those fish," said Delta. "You would rather die than get out of this mess alive?" "I have never failed a client yet," I said. "And I am not going to let some fucked up indigenous types get in my way." "We are outgunned and outnumbered," Gamma snarled. "They won't hesitate to kill us." "If they wanted us dead, it would have been so by now," I reasoned. I looked past them, back the way we came. They are toying with us. They don't believe we can make it, much less apprehend one of their precious red fish. Frankly, I'd like to spit in their faces, on both accounts. "Your pride will lead us to our deaths," said Delta. "The risk of death was always part of this job," I retorted. "What the hell did you think you signed on for?" "I don't fear death," said Gamma. "What I fear is being sentenced to death under false pretenses by ignorant, dishonest clients. Once that trust is breached, consider my services null and void." Epsilon and Delta grunted in agreement. I gaped at them. "Gentlemen, we are supposed to be the best of the best, cutthroat, elite, what they turn to when no one else will fit the bill. You renege on this now, and it's over for you. For all of us." The 3 of them glared at me. For a moment, I thought they'd consider it. A tribal shout echoed from the woods, and they snapped over to look at it, then back at me. "Oh, not like this," said Epsilon. "Naked, misled, undignified." He averted his gaze and trudged away. Delta and Gamma followed him. I kept quiet, opting to stick to the back of the group. Unbeknownst to them, I was seething, mouthing silent curses at their backs. I, myself, would bring back a Piraruku to spite them. To spite them all. The further we pushed, the higher the water crept up our bodies until we were waist-deep in stained, foul-smelling swamp. Brambles and gnarled bushes stuck out from the surface, requiring us to squeeze through or duck under walls of branches. More than before, I felt exposed and vulnerable. Submerged thorns poked at my bare thighs, and the occasional unseen object brushed against my more delicate bits. I tried not to imagine the sensitive skin down there, snagging on an underwater thorn and ripping free. I should have been grateful that it was only so shallow. During the wet season, the water level would be 50 feet higher. Caimans and anacondas would be swimming nearly 4 stories above us otherwise. The other 3 pretended as though I weren't there. which I didn't mind in the slightest. I'd have some less than kind things to say about them once I killed a Piraruku and brought it back myself. Oh, dark, delicious satisfaction. Despite the circumstances, a laugh yearned to jump free from my chest. I wanted to watch their sorry faces as they choked on humble pie. The red fish became more than just a job for me. It became validation. Finally, the vegetation thinned out, and our party wound up in a chest-deep lagoon. A quick glance at the sun confirmed we were still going south, towards the pikes, but more submerged trees blocked the horizon beyond. Apparently, the reserve stretched on for longer than we'd thought. As we pushed forward, I noticed something that the other men were too committed to see. Soft, swirling ripples sporadically formed at the surface. In these parts, it could have been any number of creatures, but somehow, I knew they were the telltale signs of Piraruku, taking lungfuls of air. I lingered, watching the men fan out ahead of me. I could feel sharp, solid branches buried in the muck below my feet. If I could fashion one of those into a spear. Lost in thought, the ground below me suddenly gave way, and I sank past my nose. Sputtering, I kicked off and forced myself to tread. I stroked through the water, looking around for the others, but they were still walking, the water at their chests. And within a few seconds, my feet met submerged ground once more. I must have wandered through a depression or a hole of some kind. I looked around at the others, and sure enough, Epsilon seemed to bob in the water for a moment before finding his footing again. "What the hell?" he muttered, reaching down and scraping up something from the water. The moment his hand broke the surface, I knew we were fucked. I only saw the sunlight passing through the eggs slipping between his fingers before the surface next to him exploded. Epsilon cried out in pain, clutching his right shoulder and kicking off from his attacker. The way his arm hung limp told me it was dislocated from a large, fast, blunt force. "We're in their fucking nests!" I screamed, strafing to the side. "Spread out! Away from the center!" Delta and Gamma propelled themselves away from the fray. Epsilon could only manage an ungainly, half-treading movement. Even in the cloudy water, I could see his own destruction in his wake. A cloud of dislodged fish eggs, spiraling in the whirls he was making. Claps of water snapped next to him. "Get to the trees!" I commanded. As Delta and Gamma reached for the overhanging boughs, I fished a broken branch from the silt and set off after him. It was flimsy and short, next to useless as a weapon, but even if I could just injure one of the Piraruku, I could both save Epsilon and pursue a then crippled fish. I saw the whirl before it jumped. Hot instinct took over, and I sidestepped in the water. A foaming torrent flared up, and I saw it. A living missile with beady, pitch-black eyes, long as I was tall, slicing through open air like it was nothing. A whip of wind slashed my cheek as it streaked past and splashed into the water behind me. A foot to my right, and it would have taken off my head. I tried to curse, but all that came out was a strangled yelp. My vision tunneled, and I forced myself forward, trying to get to Epsilon, who had almost reached a submerged tree, facing backwards and kicking at his pursuers. Just beyond the range of his flailing feet, one rocketed from the water and struck him square in the chest. Even from a distance, I saw his ribs collapse. A single, deathly puff of air expelled from his mouth, followed swiftly by a dribble of blood. Capillaries burst in his eyes as he choked one last time. Then he sank below the surface. It killed him, I told myself. My God, it fucking killed him. The flimsy waterlogged stick in my grasp seemed even more useless. Commotion behind me welled up. I whipped around to find Gamma and Delta had hoisted themselves up a tree out of the water, but the branches were splitting under their grasps. Below, the muddy water churned with the looming fish. "Higher!" Delta growled, hurling himself upwards. His branch snapped and hung limp by a few sinews, but he had secured a grip on a higher bough. One-handed, the man curled his arm and threw his upper body over the branch, his bare feet a good 2 meters from the water. Gamma lowered himself to build momentum and pull the same stunt, but his branch snapped. He plunged into the water, still maintaining his death grip. Once again, a few sinews kept the branch attached to the tree, and he scrambled to try and climb it like a rope. A monstrous pirarucu lanced through the air and sliced through the man's face like butter. Gamma's head dropped to the side, but I could clearly see the gaping hole where his lower jaw once was, shiny and ragged with torn flesh. A broad stripe of red gushed down his exposed front. His fingers loosened. He slid down the branch agonizingly slow, crashing into the water. Blood clouded from his lifeless corpse, which immediately roiled with tiny, scavenging fry. "Oh, fuck me," I gasped. The lagoon had been churned into a turbulent cauldron of mud and blood, but I saw no more signs of surfacing pirarucu. I signaled silently to Delta, pointing from him to the line of dense cover at the lagoon's far end. As he navigated through the branches, keeping clear of the water's surface, I lowered past my nose and waded forward as smoothly as possible. My heartbeat amplified in the water, nothing short of a signaling drum for any more pirarucu, but nothing more disturbed the surface. Apparently, we'd moved past their nests at that point. I met Delta at the tree line. The swamp stretched far beyond their twisted trunks, but at least the water level was in our waists now. He lowered himself down from the branches and splashed in front of me with a simmering glare. "Still vying to take down one of those beasts?" he said coldly. "Silence yourself and savor whatever shred of dignity you have left," I snapped. "Those things cut our party in half in less than a minute," Delta growled. "Dignity is out of the question. You and I are next. I pray I can at least watch you die first." Rage bled in me and I splashed over to him, grabbing his forearm. "Why not just fucking kill me? Now! Reap the satisfaction!" Delta didn't resist. He simply stared at me with the coolest of expressions. "Because you're just not worth it." I shoved him away but responded no further. As angry as I was, I couldn't deny that he was correct. To an extent. Without proper weapons, taking out a pirarucu in their turf would be suicide. There were 2 bodies in the lagoon north of us who could attest to that. Completing this mission never before felt more nebulous. I never admitted to Delta, but simply getting out alive seemed the most pragmatic option. I've been trained to think outside the box, to improvise, to always be 2 steps ahead of the game. But now, I felt truly trapped, unable to think beyond what I could immediately see. The tribesmen didn't think we could do it. Time was proving them more and more right. To our left, something rustled in the bushes. Delta and I whipped around to look, but the undergrowth was too dense. A hoarse whisper cut through the brush, the tribesmen's native language. "Move," I said. They said they'd be hunting us too. The unseen warrior shouted something, and a horribly familiar noise erupted in response. "Oh, fuck! Go! Go! Go!" I shouted. Delta and I submerged, breaststroking through the water, dipping underneath the overhanging branches. 2 splashes sounded off somewhere behind us, followed by the sharp, noisy slaps of dog paddling. We arrived at a fallen tree and dove underneath it. The log's slimy underside grazed past our backs, and we emerged unscathed about 15 feet beyond it. I shot a glance behind me. They jumped on top of the log, 2 huge, muscular, tawny pit bulls with red-tinted eyes and black lips jagged and torn from barking. They caught sight of us, their teeth gleaming like sabers. Then they sprung into the water, panting and paddling towards us. "Under!" Delta shouted. We both submerged, scattering in separate directions. I felt around more than I saw, pulling and squeezing my way past sunken roots. With my sense of touch heightened, I detected the dog's wake before it could strike. I wheeled around, stirring up a cloud of silt, and I saw pale eyes and a maw of canine teeth emerge from the gloom. I thrust my hand below its mouth. I grasped the wet fur of its throat and hung on. The dog struggled and writhed, spinning underwater and dragging me along, all the while snapping its ravening jaws at me, mere inches from my face, bubbles streaming, eyes rolling, paws clawing at my exposed arms and stomach. It kicked to the surface. Sunlight and clean air hit me and I gasped for breath. The pit bull emerged next. Still held at arm's length, its barks like railgun blasts in my face. It paddled forward, pushing me through the water until my back crashed into a tree. The dog slashed and clawed, overpowering my arm's strength, inching closer and closer to my throat. With a bellow, I thrust my free arm through the air and drove my thumb into its eye. It yelped and yanked its neck from my grasp, half blinded and paddling off. I looked around for Delta. It was 20 feet off from me, locked in a similar half-submerged battle with the second pit bull. I swam forward to help. When I reached them, I grabbed the scruff of the dog's neck and yanked it off Delta, who was scratched up and bleeding freely into the water. I primed my arm to gouge the second dog's eyes. The first dog lunged from behind and seized my wrist. The pain was excruciating, like a car door with nails, and I let go, letting the force carry me backwards and underwater once more. I heard screams above the surface. Before the bones in my wrist could crack, the first dog let go and pursued Delta along with the second. Survival overruled. I kicked off away from the fray, resurfacing some 10 feet off, my wrist burning with agony. Delta and the 2 dogs had been reduced to a watery frenzy of limbs, blood, barks, and screams. The man got in a few blows, signaled by the high-pitched yelps and the flying tufts of fur, but within seconds, the fur was replaced with human flesh, and Delta's struggling form devolved into a dismembered mangle of red. His screams silenced. Fighting the urge to vomit, I simply turned and swam south, towards freedom. The pit bulls did not follow, perhaps too weakened or too preoccupied to do so. Once several yards and more undergrowth separated us, I stopped to catch my breath, my injured wrist trembling. My vision overturned, my head was fuzzy with adrenaline. I had grown to hate my crew, but I hadn't wanted them to pay like this. The red fish was supposed to do that. I was supposed to do that. I'd wanted them to feel the misery of defeat and humiliation. Now, the red fish meant nothing to me. Nothing but a cold reminder of all that had put us through this mess. I continued onward through the undergrowth. If the opportunity presented itself, I would take it. But otherwise, getting out alive was now the goal. I emerged into another lagoon. This time, the setting was recognizable. At the far end, the water narrowed into a channel blocked off by sharp pikes. I looked around. I appeared alone. I could make it across, leave the reserve. They would let me live. Redfish or no redfish, I was going to make it. As I swam forward, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. An overturned canoe floating in the water before me, surrounded by surfacing Pararuku. My mind immediately drew a connection. Much like how floating debris in the open ocean attracted seafaring fish, this abandoned canoe seemed to serve as a gathering point for Pararuku. And they hadn't noticed me. If I could sneak up on one and catch one, just one by surprise, I'd have the edge. Holding on and dispatching it would be another story, but I tried not to think about it as I entered stealth mode and approached the canoe. The fish continued to surface regularly, 30 feet. My motions were careful and calculated. Only my eyes and forehead were visible above the water. 20 feet. They still seemed preoccupied with the canoe. The boat was dark in color, not the same ones we had arrived in several hours earlier. Was it one of the tribesmen's canoes? What was it doing overturned in the middle of the lagoon in the first place? At 10 feet, the fish scattered. I slapped at the water, belting out a string of curses. It was over. I lacked the energy to pursue them further, and the longer I lingered, the more likely the tribesmen would find some other way to kill me. Then, the canoe moved. It swiveled in the water to face me. That's when I saw the pattern of scales, the organic way the sunlight reflected off of it. It sank. A red, scallop-shaped tail the size of a sewer grate swirled through the water above it before it disappeared. Oh, God, was all I could muster. The water below transformed into a suction. I was too paralyzed to resist. I sank feet first below the surface, watching helplessly as my legs disappeared into the Leviathan Pararuku's gaping mouth. I caught sight of its black eyes, unfeeling, uncaring, before my head slipped past its bony lips. Within a second, I was encased in a black, fleshy, watery coffin. True fear set in. I thought back to my crew, the violent progression of death that had whittled us down, each more hideous than the last, ending with me being swallowed alive by an outlandishly huge red fish. The muscles in its throat contracted, squeezing me further down its gullet. I gave up. I waited for the sting of stomach acid, the strangling noxiousness of gas. Instead, what I got was light, not sunlight. This was a deep, hellish red. I couldn't determine where it was coming from. I assumed it was a hallucination, induced from a lack of oxygen. But I could clearly see the inside of the fish illuminated around me, the pulsating walls of its guts, the outline of its spine and ribs dripping with moisture. And there were others. There were others inside the fish with me. I rolled over onto my stomach and screamed. 5 bodies below me, all staring up in differing states of grotesqueness. 2 with shattered foreheads, 1 bleeding from the mouth, 1 with his lower jaw missing. and one nearly torn apart, his muscles and organs exposed. My men. For the first time in my life, I broke. I closed my eyes and shrieked, beating at the organic wall around me, the cadavers below, my own flesh, crying for deliverance, an end, a mercy killing to take me away from whatever fresh hell this was. I don't remember much else after that. All I know is at some point I ended up outside the reserve, back where we started. Our canoes were still there, having run aground on the sloping bank. I stood far up the shoreline, watching as more boats showed up at the pikes. They were slick, motorized, definitely government vessels. Military police jumped from the boats regarding our abandoned canoes before crossing over inside the reserve. They didn't look at me once. I doubt they even noticed me. I doubt that they could have noticed me. Instead, their attention was drawn to something in the lagoon beyond the pikes. It was a corpse, floating face down. From my distance, I couldn't tell whose body it was. It could have been mine, for all I knew. "Yep, it's one of them," one of the soldiers confirmed. "Matched the description the fireman gave us." "All they wanted to do was go fishing," another said, shaking his head. "Those goddamn savages," a third growled. "See how far the little deal goes now." Brandishing their carbines, they stalked deeper into the reserve. A day later, drifting among the crowds of the local town, I learned that with the murders of the 6 fishermen, the deal between the politicians and the indigenous tribesmen had dissolved. The proposed law protecting the Pirarucu was tossed, and the tribe responsible for their deaths had been neutralized. The atmosphere in the town was of celebration. With no more encroaching regulations and no indigenous tribes to worry about, local fishermen were readying their harpoons and nets to set out and take advantage of the surprise bounty. Some expressed their concerns, warning that the sudden influx of fishing pressure would irrevocably damage the Pirarucu populations, leading to their extinction from the area. But the red fish's allure was too strong to grant them any credence. A few of these fishermen, I noticed, were showing off their new toys: spear guns, dynamite, canisters of poison, things they couldn't have gotten without a little outside help. It didn't take long to guess who in the region had the money and the motivation to fund their missions. I guess my client was right in the end. With the will and the means, who was he to deny what he wanted? Suddenly, Gamma's suspicions about having been lied to made sense. I couldn't stop them if I tried. Greed had overtaken them. They were beyond saving. Mindless husks set out to reap the Pirarucu. In the end, there'd only be one winner, and I hated him for it. Instead, all I could do was wonder what would become of them. I found myself wishing my fate upon them all. A stripping, a gauntlet, suffering. And finally, to cap it all off, ravenous, all-consuming death. Hopefully, in the end, they'd learn to realize the futility of their endeavors. Maybe they'd end up like me, Something less than flesh, more than idea. An imprint of sin. A shade. Hopefully, they'd learn to finally respect the red fish.
Deputy Waylon Dupree winced when the first wave of thunder shook his patrol car. It was low and rumbling, as if the earth beneath him were crashing through the canopy of asphalt to take hold of him. The heavy rain came soon after. He struggled against the high winds to stay on the road. Add in some of that telekinesis and telepathy stuff, and you've got yourself something right out of a Stephen King novel. At 21, Waylon was the youngest deputy in the Bidwell County Sheriff's Department in Weldon, Mississippi. Population 109.5. It used to be an even 110, but Mervyn Garnell had gone and gotten his legs lopped off while trying to dislodge a raccoon carcass from his combine. As the rookie, Waylon had the sublime privilege of working the graveyard shift in a town roughly the size of your average Walmart.
Lord of Moses, that wasn't no clap of thunder. That was a dadgum standing ovation.
It was almost 2 in the morning, and Waylon was dog-tired. The bottom had dropped out of the rain-heavy sky, and now he couldn't see 2 feet in front of him. He decided to be sensible about the whole exhaustion/biblical flood thing and find a place to pull over and grab some shut-eye. He knew of a car wash about 5 miles up the road on State Road 29, where he could swing into one of those outdoor stalls and nod off till the storm passed. Waylon was well acquainted with the area. He'd grown up in the pinprick town of Blytheville. For well over a century, his kinfolk had filled the graveyards of Weldon, Blytheville, and nearby Buckhorn. His family's sweat and bones were in the soil of each of the small farming communities. Everybody knew each other. Most were related in some way or another. As denizens of the peaceful rural life, their biggest concern centered around increasing their crops yields and not accidentally coming onto their cousin in a bar. But there was also the unspoken yearning to run away from the land that absorbed its people like a sponge in a hurricane. The place never quite let you go. It sure hadn't let go of Waylon. Waylon took his time getting to the car wash. This wasn't the time for hot rodding. He pulled into one of the open stalls and killed the old Crown Vic's massive 250 horsepower V8 monster motor. He sank into the well-worn butt crater bequeathed him by his lard-bottomed predecessor, the newly and thankfully retired Big Mick Harvey. Waylon was just about to cross over into Snoozeville, USA, when the booming voice of Deb from dispatch blared from the radio. The fearless female officer was a boisterous, hard-drinking, rough-and-tumble kind of gal, whom the boys at the department clandestinely referred to as Old Glory. The name had come about because each of them claimed to have been on top of her at some point.
Waylon! Oh, Waylon! Boy, are you asleep out there? Just grunt and let me know you're alive.
I'm here, Deb. What's up?
I got a good one for you. You remember old Mabel Luckabee?
Mabel was the stuff of legend in their neck of the woods. She was a mean old cuss who never met a person she could tolerate or a deodorant she couldn't overcome. If cleanliness is next to godliness, then Mabel was the Antichrist. She was now well into her 70s and living alone in her raggedy 2-story farmhouse in Weldon. A widow by vocation, some of the townsfolk opined that her last husband, Ed, had passed away not because of any mishap or disease, but because, like the other poor SOBs before him, he'd wanted to. Not long after, his blue-tick hound dog, Buckethead, decided to go AWOL. Everybody figured, with Ed gone, the dog must have thought, no, you don't, and taken off for parts unknown. Mabel was an equal opportunity offender. She hated everyone, regardless of race, creed, or species. Her scowling moonscape of a face filled Waylon's mind, making him grimace.
What about her? He asked. Did she ugly away or something? Darn woman looks like the love child of Steve Buscemi and Elma the Yak Lady.
Don't know yet. I just got a call from Doreen, her nosy night owl neighbor. Says she ain't seen her since Monday. That's 2 days ago. Doreen's tried calling her, but she won't answer the phone. She's also said the house lights have been on the whole time. I need you to do a welfare check. I know she's a pain, so just peek in her window and see if she's moving around.
Can't we just wait a few days to see if the buzzards are circling her house?
Come on now, Waylon. You and me both know 2 things. 1, the buzzards won't go anywhere near her because it might lower their culinary standards. And 2, you ain't got nothing better to do.
Deb, the only thing worse than finding that old hag alive would be finding her dead.
Well, if she is, her funeral's gonna draw quite a crowd.
Why? Nobody can stand her.
That's true, but you know what they say. Give the people what they want, and they'll show up in droves. Ha ha ha.
Fair point. All right then, I'm on my way.
The rain had begun to ease off, but the thunder and lightning were still raising a fuss. Waylon was thankful for the graveled lane that led up to the Luckabee house. Otherwise, he would have had to swim for it. After roughly 30 yards of potholes and low-hanging tree limbs, he pulled up to the decrepit old place. Waylon had been there a few times during his childhood to chuck rocks and cherry bombs, but with the storm still laying haymakers, the house looked more foreboding than he remembered. The lengthy shards of white paint that the claws of time had carved away made it look like a large potato that had gone a few rounds with an angry vegetable peeler. Its tattered roof sloped down to rusty gutters from which lush, rambling gardens of weeds flourished. Looming from the blackness, the eerie eyesore brought to Waylon's mind an exterior set from a Rob Zombie movie. Waylon grabbed a small mag light from his service belt, put on his plastic-covered deputy's hat, and jogged to the house's front porch. Its weak structural integrity gave him pause.
This porch makes me think of Mabel. Old, nasty, and sagging in all the worst places.
Waylon looked through the windows but didn't see anyone. He pounded on the door. No one answered, so he banged harder.
Mrs. Luckabee! Oh, Mrs. Luckabee! Sheriff's Department! Mrs. Luckabee, you in there?
When he failed to get a response, he tried the doorknob. Mabel had left the door unlocked, so he stepped inside. Waylon walked through the house's main floor calling the elderly woman's name,
Mrs. Luckabee!
but all was still and silent.
Sheriff's Department!
With each step, the sticky wooden floorboards groaned as if they were dying. As he went from one disheveled room to another, he was amazed and appalled at the amount of debris that Mabel had hoarded. There were several dozen unopened boxes from QVC, old clothes and magazines, dusty porcelain dolls, and other creepy items that might indicate someone wearing a skin suit was about to come at you with a running chainsaw.
Girl, you are seriously messed up.
As he ventured further into the cramped house, a nostril-searing stench hit him square in the nose.
Whoo-wee! Smells like feet, farts, and Fritos in here.
Waylon headed up the stairs to check out what he figured might be a bedroom, a bathroom, and given the vibe of the creepy dump, a possible kill room. When he reached the second-floor landing, he heard a faint sound coming from one of the rooms.
Mrs. Luckabee? That you?
He followed the noise to one of the rooms and found the door ajar. He pushed it open and saw Mabel lying on her bed. Dressed in a dingy white nightgown, she was propped up on a pillow, staring at a small portable TV located on a dresser near the bed's foot.
Oh, hey, Mrs. Luckabee. You probably don't remember me, but I'm Don and Linda Dupree's boy, Waylon. I come by to check on you. You okay?
Mabel didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. She just kept staring blankly at the TV as if it had hypnotized her.
I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to make sure you're all right. Are you? All right, I mean.
Mabel continued to ignore him, so he walked between her and the TV. She kept looking ahead as if he weren't there. Waylon went to grab hold of her toes and give them a shake, but when he saw the thick curled nails, he poked her foot with the hand-sized maglite instead.
Note to self, destroy my flashlight.
When she didn't respond, Waylon walked around to the side of the bed. He leaned in close to her and whispered,
Mrs. Luckabee? Mrs. Luckabee.
He pushed the side of her greasy head with the tip of his maglite, and she keeled over on her side.
Judas on a tricycle.
Waylon felt for a pulse but found none. Then he heard a faint scratching as Mabel's bottom lip began pulsing outward. He held back his sickness when 2 large brown cockroaches exited her mouth. After pulling in a few deep breaths to quell his disgust, he pressed the talk button on his shoulder radio.
Deb, Waylon here. Pick up.
The radio crackled, and Deb's voice filled the room, too loud for Waylon's taste.
Sup, Waylon? How's the Wicked Witch of Weldon?
Why don't you ask her? She's standing right here.
He chuckled at poor Deb's expense.
Oh, sorry about that, Mrs. Luckabee. I was just...
It's all right, Deb. She can't hear you. She's deader than Kevin Spacey's acting career.
Oh, crap. Really?
Yep. In fact, you can call her whatever you want. She ain't coming.
Well, ain't you nice? Didn't your mama ever tell you never to speak ill of the dead? Though I guess we can make an exception in old Mabel's case. It ain't like she's gonna mind. You know, I don't mean the old gal no disrespect, but the only way I'm gonna be able to squirt a tear during this here tender moment is if I yank out a nose hair.
Whatever. Listen, call in a...
Waylon bent his head away from the radio's high-pitched whine.
Deb, are you there?
Wait. Where? Cat. Get out.
Struggling to communicate with Deb, Waylon retreated downstairs in search of a better signal.
Deb, can you hear me?
He was relieved when she answered.
Yeah, I can hear you, but barely. You keep bobbing and weaving on me. Listen, I've already let the sheriff, know about Mabel. I won't repeat what he called her. He's still on his fishing trip, so he won't be there till almost sunup. I also contacted the first responders down in Camford, but they're at least a half hour out. Said that the storm had caused some trees and power line damage, so it may be even longer. Just sit tight until they arrive. In the meantime, I'm gonna need you to secure the scene and keep watch.
Keep watch? You mean like in babysitting a dead body till the meat wagon and the sheriff arrive?
Listen, Waylon, I know it seems like a big deal when you're new and all, but it'll be okay. Just make sure you don't disturb nothing. The sheriff will take care of the scene. Just go ahead and start your report.
Geez, Deb, of all the corpses to be locked in with on a stormy night, I had to draw Mabel Luckabees.
A low hum came over the radio.
Deb, you there?
Silence. Waylon sighed at first, then decided to make light of his predicament. He held the radio's mic up to his face and announced, "Well, hey there, all you night owls. You're listening to WAYN, where the hits just keep on coming." Then, like a bad omen, the pounding rain returned with a vengeance. Waylon went back upstairs to check out the rest of the second floor. He was happy to find that the upper floor rooms were not as cluttered and dirty as downstairs. When he finished his exploration, he went into Mabel's room, took out his cell phone, and snapped some pics for his report. Once he got that out of the way, he shut off the TV and headed back downstairs to look for coffee. He was halfway down when he heard a loud click followed by the sound of the TV coming on. What the heck is that all about? Waylon re-entered Mabel's bedroom. The old tube television was on, and Mabel's body was propped up on the pillow again. Waylon was unnerved and confused. Say, wasn't she... He watched the lifeless body for a few seconds. When it didn't move, he turned off the antiquated boob box, then walked to the door. It was on again. Waylon was adhered to the floor, afraid to turn around. He was relieved to observe that when he did, and with only a tad of guilt, Mabel was still dead as a brick. Waylon figured the mystery had a reasonable explanation, so he shifted into seasoned cop mode. He told himself that all he was dealing with was a prehistoric television, plugged into the wall socket of an old rickety house with suspect wiring. Piece of crap television, he thought. Thing's older than Moses' babysitter. Waylon reached behind the TV and yanked its cord from the wall, then glared at the blank screen. Now shut the heck up, or I'm gonna take out my gun and go Scarface on you. Waylon made his way down to the kitchen and began looking through the cracked, faded cabinets for some much-needed Java. It took a lot of searching, but he finally found an ancient jar of freeze-dried coffee. The jar was sticky, the grounds clumped together like a rich, robust hockey puck. Waylon had guessed that someone had likely purchased the brown muck sometime during the Clinton administration. Has it come to this? Do I really need caffeine this bad? Begrudgingly, he accepted that he did. He turned his search toward finding a clean cup, as well as something in which to boil water. He flipped on one of the stove's burners and started digging around. When he saw a relatively clean mug, he lifted it as if he had found the Holy Grail and sang, "Ta-da!" There was a brilliant flash of lightning, followed by a floor-shaking thunder. Then the power went out. Oh, sweet lady of perpetual nonsense, what now? Waylon thought. Pulling his defiled maglite from his belt, he went looking for the fuse box. He didn't have to look for long. There was one located inside the kitchen's walk-in pantry. Waylon inspected the black briquette that was once the main fuse. Deader than a mean old woman in a farmhouse bedroom, he thought. Dust and dirt trickled down onto Waylon's hat like grimy rain. The sharp noise came from the room directly above him, Mabel's bedroom. His knocking knees betrayed his fear as his breath retreated into his lungs, refusing to come out. On the one hand, he knew it was his duty to go and check on things, but the other hand was telling him to grab the rest of his body and run like a crack-addled gazelle into the raging night. He settled the internal argument by siding with the more sensible hand. Waylon much preferred braving the torrential rain and sitting in his cruiser to staying in what he was rapidly coming to consider the redneck version of Hill House. In addition, he still needed to fill out a report. He was thankful that the paperwork was in the car, thus affording him a plausible case for reasonable cowardice. When Waylon reached the front door, he tried the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Then, as if on cue, a sinister cackle bled through his radio, making his arm hairs stand on end. He began to fear that a powerful supernatural force might be at play. The idea chilled him. Taking a few steps backward, Waylon warned the silent crowd of imaginary gawkers.
Stand back, y'all. I'm fixing to make a Waylon-shaped hole in this door.
Then an uncomfortable thought hit him.
Oh, for the love of Lucy. The guys at the station will never let me forget it if I run like a little girl from a spooky old house. Gotta tap into my inner Chuck Norris and handle this case like one of the big boys.
He drew what he could from his shallow puddle of courage and ventured back upstairs to inspect Mabel's bedroom again. When Waylon got there, his first act was to locate the source of the noises. Confusion collided with unease as he observed that nothing, including the recently departed Mabel, had moved. However, the lack of activity only served to make him more nervous.
Screw the guys. I'm done with this place.
As Waylon was leaving, the bed spring squeaked, followed by the unsettling sounds of somebody scampering away. He turned around and saw that Mabel was literally dead and gone. His skin tingled at the implications. He shined his mag light around the lightless room, praying that the formerly deceased woman wouldn't come running at him from one of the pitch-dark corners. Despite the massive storm bellowing outside, the world fell silent for Waylon. The weight of his dread submerged his entire mind in a cold black pool of fear and disbelief.
Where's Steve and Elma?
The scratchy voice said. Waylon spun around several times, the flashlight's beam hopping around the room like a bouncing ball of light. Suddenly, bare feet slapped across the wooden floor as the thing rushed into the bedroom closet, slamming the door shut.
Mrs. Luckabee, that you?
The closet door creaked open halfway, and a shadowy figure crawled out. Its neck made a cracking sound as its head swiveled in Waylon's direction. Glowing yellow eyes peered up at him, numbing his quivering body. He focused a funnel of light on the thing dressed in a nightgown. Mabel's contorted body looked like a pretzel playing a game of Twister. Her breathing was quick and shallow, her frame heaving with every pant. As soon as the light settled on her crinkled face, she squealed and scuttled under the bed. Waylon's twitching hand rested on the butt of his service revolver. With great wariness, he plodded over to Mabel's last known resting place.
Why don't you join me down here, Don and Linda's boy?
Icy dots spread across Waylon's sweating body like frigid spiders skittering on bare skin. Against his better judgment and basic common sense, Waylon lowered his head toward the floor. Alabaster arms shot out of the mattress and gnarled hands seized him by his hat. Screaming, he twisted his head free of the ghostly grip. Waylon sped from the bedroom and toward the staircase. After a few clumsy steps, his feet flew out from under him, landing him on his backside. Helpless against gravity, he tobogganed down the painful steps, farting loudly with each violent bounce. Finally, his noisy hindquarters found the bottom of the stairs. After pulling himself up, Waylon returned to the locked front door. Grabbing the knob with both hands, he used all his strength to turn it, but his efforts proved fruitless. He pressed the button on his radio.
Damn! For the love of the Lord, please answer me!
The radio was still dead. His next idea was to try to break out through one of the windows. Waylon ran to the living room and tried opening one, but it wouldn't budge. He pushed up on the next one, same result. Desperate, he grabbed a small coffee table and hurled it against the window. It bounced off the glass like a tennis ball. He was about to use his gun to help improve his luck when a coffee mug went sailing past his head, shattering against the impenetrable window. He whirled around and saw the lower back part of Mabel's nightgown disappearing around the kitchen doorway. Waylon yanked the gun from its holster, gripping it tightly in his right hand while holding the mag light in the other.
That's enough now. This is Deputy Sheriff Waylon Dupree. You better make yourself known.
There was a movement in the dining room. He went to investigate. The dust from the many items stacked around the dim room flittered in the bright ray of the flashlight. Waylon's nerves were bouncing around inside him like a pinball. He steered the beam around the room.
I hope you all show up in droves.
Quitting time!
Waylon sprinted to the front door, where he fired every round in his gun directly at the doorknob, only to have them rebound off. His heart was racing as if it were qualifying for the Daytona 500.
Let me out of here! Whoever you are, please let me go! I'll jump in my squad car and leave right now!
Footsteps emanated from the front sitting room. Waylon heard the crackling sound of a phonograph needle making contact with the vinyl. An old-school swing-style dance number reverberated throughout the downstairs. He recognized the tune as one his grandma listened to whenever she decided to up the dosage of what she called her happy time nerve medicine. It was an old Judy Garland song from the 1960s called Come On, Get Happy. Soon, Judy's voice chimed in with a bouncy beat.
Forget your troubles, come on, get happy. You better chase all your cares away. Shout hallelujah, come on, get happy. Get ready for the judgment day.
Waylon raised his flashlight, holstered his empty pistol, and entered the dark room. His body became one large icicle. The late Mabel Luckabee, her back to him, stood in front of a large wooden stereo cabinet, swaying in time with the teeny-sounding tune.
Mrs. Luckabee? Mabel? Ma'am?
She stopped moving and snapped to attention. Waylon continued.
The station house sent me here to check on you. You was upstairs dead, but clearly you're feeling better, so I guess I'll be leaving now.
Waylon watched slack-jawed and bug-eyed as the moving corpse levitated and spun around to face him. He aimed the flashlight at the hag, accentuating her face's pallor. Her yellow eyes blazed with raw hatred. His mind was yelling at him to escape, but his body refused to cooperate. He struggled to work up enough spit to speak.
Miss Luckabee, I just want to leave and...
The shrill sound, coupled with the force of her voice, caused all of the first-floor windows to burst outwards. Her body flew through the air at Waylon. He shrieked, then hurled the maglite at her as hard as he could. Finally, his mind and body got on the same page, and he fled from the flying corpse. Waylon turned and ran straight for one of the paneless windows, launching himself like a twirling meat missile. After landing on the front porch, Waylon rolled into the railing with so much force that his body busted through it and out into the yard. The violent impact made him look like a human bowling ball landing a perfect strike. Just as he was hauling himself up from the thick brown mud, he heard a siren in the distance.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus.
The EMTs were the first on the scene. Dave, the long-suffering sheriff, was still on his way back from his ill-fated fishing trip. They found Waylon standing in the front yard, in the middle of the vicious storm, a 1,000-yard stare in his eyes. The team couldn't get anything out of him, so they had him wait in the back of the ambulance while they dealt with Mabel. After 20 minutes or so, one of the paramedics came down to grab some gear and check on Waylon, who was still shell-shocked.
You want to tell me what happened in there? The windows are all busted out and the place is a wreck. Was it like that when you got here?
Waylon was regaining his wits. He realized that there was no scenario in which the paramedics, or anyone else for that matter, were going to believe him. Resigned to his peculiar predicament, he muttered,
"Yep."
Well, observations like that fall under your authority anyway,
the paramedic said.
I'll just go on with my job then.
He began placing items in a small vinyl bag. Before he left for the house, he turned and said,
As soon as we finish up here, I want to take you in for a quick checkup. You look like you might still be in shock. Hell's bells on an Easter bonnet. I thought you boys were supposed to be used to all this stuff.
He had only taken a few steps when Waylon called after him.
Hey, tell me something. Where'd you find the body? Did you see anything unusual?
You mean other than the house being beat to crap? We found her upstairs in bed. She was lying back on a pillow staring straight ahead. Creepy as all get out. She must have known a blackout was coming, though.
Why's that?
She had a small mag light in her hand.
Then he left Waylon alone to ponder his sanity.
Am I crazy? Or did I let my rookie self get so worked up that I started imagining things?
He wondered.
What a wuss.
Waylon had nearly talked himself down off the 50th floor ledge of the crazy building when the radio in the front cab of the ambulance turned itself on. The sound of Julie Garland's mellifluous voice pushed Waylon off the side of his mental skyscraper as she crooned.
Forget your troubles, come on, get happy. You better chase all your cares away. Shout hallelujah, come on, get happy. Get ready for the judgment day.
Chilling tales for dark nights.